To help us make sense of where things stand with zoonosis, we're lucky to be joined this morning by experts in 3 different kinds of fields of study: beef, quarantine, and border health services at the CDC's Division of Global Migration and Quarantine, where she protects travelers' health and prevents the introduction of zoonotic diseases related to animal imports into the United States. To talk about companion animals, pets, we have with us Dr. John Albers, president of the consulting firm Albers Veterinary Strategies, former executive director of the American Animal Hospital Association. And finally, to shed some light on the issues concerning our food animals, we're joined by Beth Johnson, founder of the Washington-based consulting firm Food Directions, LLC, former acting undersecretary for food safety at the USDA. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Marano to kick things off for a couple minutes of opening remarks about her work in the field of zoonosis, and then we'll follow that with statements from Dr. Albers and Ms. Johnson. Thank you.
I do. As said, I'm responsible for oversight of quarantine stations where we look at people, animals, and things coming into the United States, and it keeps us quite busy. So my remarks this morning are oriented towards that aspect. The worldwide movement of animals has increased the potential for the translocation of zoonotic diseases which can pose serious risks to both human and animal health. The magnitude of the global animal movement in animals is staggering. Between 2000 and 2006, over 1.48 billion live amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles were legally imported to the United States from 163 countries. Why do we have a global trade in animals? Well, they're legally imported to the United States for multiple reasons: for exhibitions at zoos, for scientific education, research, and conservation programs, as food and products, and in the case of companion animals, for tourism and immigration. Increasingly, however, animals are being imported for a thriving commercial pet trade. In many cases, the animals that are imported and traded are of species that are considered exotic here. We define that as non-native species or animals that are not traditionally kept as pets. This can be a risky business, as many shipments include a high volume of animals that are wild-caught versus captive-raised. For the majority of these animals, there is no requirements for zoonotic disease screening, either pre- or post-arrival to the United States, and anecdotally, there have been high rates of mortality among animals in these shipments. Animals imported for the commercial trade do represent a significant risk to human health. In 2003, monkeypox was introduced to the United States when a shipment of African Gambian rats was sold to dealers, one of whom housed the rats with prairie dogs intended for the pet trade as in a U.S. distribution facility. The prairie dogs subsequently became ill and transmitted the infection to 71 humans, including prairie dog owners and veterinary staff caring for the ill animals. In addition to monkeypox, human tularemia and salmonella outbreaks have been traced back to contact with prairie dogs and hedgehogs, both used in the pet trade. Exotic pet ownership can bring unanticipated risks both to agribusiness, wildlife conservation, and the ecosystem. For example, African land snails released into farmlands have become agricultural pests, reproducing rapidly and consuming large amounts of vegetation, and are hosts for parasites. Pet pythons released into wetlands can become unchecked predators, warping the balance of the existing food chain. Snakehead fish, imported as a delicacy for the live food markets, have turned up in ponds and waterways where they quickly dominate the ecosystem at the expense of native species. And the illegal trade of exotic wildlife, with promises of considerable financial return in the underground markets, has disastrous implications for many endangered and threatened species. How easy is it to get an exotic animal? Have you checked the internet lately? It's now possible to obtain almost any type of exotic pet animal via the internet, as opposed to purchasing them in pet stores, which are subject to licensure and inspection. As a scientist, one might suggest solutions using familiar tools, such as post-arrival screening of animals with reliable laboratory tests, or treating them empirically for known diseases, if such tests and treatment did exist, or quarantining the animals for an appropriate length of time. Many of these solutions are not feasible or practical to employ in the large volume of animals that are being imported and cannot be employed to prevent new or emerging pathogens or infections. Ultimately, import restrictions may be the only means of preventing introduction of exotic infections. Despite the societal costs of importing exotic animals, as well as difficulties in regulating enforcement and coordination of efforts, it's essential to remember that there's also benefits and compelling reasons for importing certain species of wildlife. Wildlife conservation programs and species survival programs depend on importing exotic animals, including endangered species kept by zoos. Much is learned from captive wild animals and the knowledge gained there about how to manage disease problems. Zoological Society's ability to use animals that are legally imported has enabled public education about endangered animals, and were it not for legal animal importation and exhibition in zoological institutions, many animals, including bats, would be extinct in the wild. Partnerships comprising experts and agencies involved with human, animal, and ecosystem health are critical to prevent and control imported zoonotic diseases, which would benefit public, animal, and ecosystem health. The public and animal health sectors should renew their efforts to work together through the One Health framework to mitigate the impact on infectious disease ecology caused by unrestricted translocation of animals. Prevention efforts should include reducing both the supply of and the demand for exotic animals. However, navigating the myriad responsibilities of the different sectors for human, livestock, companion animal, and wildlife health continues to be a challenge. Guidelines addressing the infectious disease risks associated with exotic animals have been published, which may help raise awareness of the risks and decrease the demand for exotic animals. However, no single agency can solve this problem alone. It's only through partnership with other federal agencies, wildlife associations, veterinary medical associations, and private industry that we will be able to better control the global movement of animals and reduce the risk of introducing emerging infectious diseases into new locations.
Good morning. My focus this morning is on pet animals or companion animals, and just to set the stage, I'm going to point out that we have over 135 million dogs and cats living in over half the households in the United States, so our interaction with pets is huge. I do want to point out, however, that Julian said that zoonotic diseases are diseases that are passed from animals to humans, and I need to point out that it can go the other way too. I don't want animals to get the bad rap, get all the blame, and they comprise a large component of companion animal practice. Fortunately, the good news is that virtually all of those problems can be controlled, prevented, or treated by very safe and efficacious vaccines and also pharmaceuticals. So if we talk about infectious disease, of course, the thing that always comes to mind is rabies, and that is, of course, a very, very serious infectious disease. The good news, again, is that it's extremely rare in pets, primarily because of mandatory rabies vaccination requirements and virtually throughout the state, and also for dogs and cats coming into the country. So the biggest real threat to humans relative to rabies comes from wildlife, not from pets. Another infectious disease that's gotten some attention recently is leptospirosis, usually waterborne bacterial disease that at one time veterinarians commonly vaccinated for, kind of got away from vaccinating because it was so uncommon. Anecdotal evidence in the last 5 to 7 years or so has indicated that it's on the increase, so vaccinations have increased in companion animal practice. And again, the biggest threat to humans is really through water that's been contaminated by wildlife rather than from pets. We hear a lot about MRSA lately, that's methicillin-resistant strep aureus infections. That transmission can happen from human to animals and animals to humans, and in fact there's some interesting cases in which it's gone back and forth several times. Both humans and animals can be asymptomatic, or in other words, no obvious sign, but they can be reservoirs or carriers of methicillin-resistant strep aureus. A big area of companion animal practice involves parasite control. Some of these parasites are transmissible to people. We classify them as either internal or external parasites. Internal parasites being primarily intestinal worms, if you will. Roundworms and hookworms particularly are transmissible to people, usually through poor sanitation habits. Again, the good news is that there are very safe and efficacious products to prevent parasite infestation in pets, and virtually all veterinarians in the U.S. at least encourage their pet owners to keep their pets on year-round parasite prevention products, which again are safe and do prevent parasites. There are also some external parasites. Of course, you all know about fleas in dogs and cats, where there's an occasional report of a flea biting a human. They really don't like us very well, so that's not much of a threat from a zoonotic standpoint. as a mange mite called sarcoptic mange that can be passed from dogs to humans. Again, it's a relatively rare and definitely treatable condition. I was asked to talk a little bit about trends in companion animal practice, and interestingly, while the trends don't involve, or the significant trends don't involve zoonotic diseases, they do parallel trends in human medicine. That is due to the fact that we have allowed many of our pets to become overweight or obese, and as a result, they have the same problems that we do in human medicine, which is an increased risk of diabetes and, of course, osteoarthritis from carrying too much weight. Again, there are medications available. There are products to treat both diabetes and arthritis in pets that are safe and efficacious. But it's, while not a zoonotic disease, it is interesting that it parallels what's happening in human medicine as well. There are some concerns in companion animal practice, companion animal segment of the profession that could be relevant to zoonotic diseases, and that is that there's almost a total lack of disease incidence data. Veterinarians don't typically use common diagnostic codes in their daily work, and when they do, those codes are not, there's not a system available that can readily download or track those codes and look at them from a national perspective in terms of what's happening in different parts of the country relative to dogs and cats. And it's interesting to think about how there's been a transition over the last 50 or 60 years as pets have moved from the barnyard to the backyard to the house to the bedroom to the bed, and even in some cases under the covers. You know who you are out there. And yet we don't really have a good idea about what health impacts and what things might be brought along with the pets that are in our bedrooms and sleeping with us. So I think there's a need in the companion animal sector to have a better disease incidence collection and data gathering and epidemiological review so that we can have earlier detection. At this point, we're not really focused on bioterrorism or pandemic kinds of diseases. They're relatively uncommon in dogs and cats in terms of them being sentinels for what might happen in human medicine, but there are at least scenarios in which we ought to consider that possibility and think about whether or not we ought to be doing a better job of tracking disease incidence in dogs and cats. Again, they live in over half of our households and very often live in very close quarters with us, so we should be paying attention to that. Thank you.
Yeah, as Julian said, I was acting Undersecretary for Food Safety and also, before that, Deputy Chief of Staff for the Secretary of Agriculture, to help bridge some of those gaps between food safety and animal health. So this morning I'm going to talk from the food animal side, and the view of I think one of the difficulties that we have in bridging that gap is that the view of public health and animal health is very different. And public health is really looking at the food, and we look at food safety, and we look at salmonella and the foodborne illnesses. And the folks that are focused on that are often very, and the media and consumer advocates and others are just very focused on the food side and what happens to the food, not necessarily the animal and animal diseases. And the only animal side that they're mostly focused on would be the treatment of those animals and how that may then impact increased risk of a foodborne illness. Not necessarily thinking about animal health, how do we keep animals healthy, how do we have a thriving livestock industry. As opposed to animal health, then obviously folks are focused on the farm, what's going on there, how is that affecting their livelihood in the industry, and I think they're very two different approaches, and certainly the efforts of the administration and the folks at CDC and USDA and others to bridge this gap of animal health and human health is very important, but I think that as we move forward in this, we have to understand that it's a pretty big gap and a pretty big long bridge maybe to build. One of the things that certainly APHIS is on the farm helping animal producers to maintain the health of their animals, surveillance, diagnosis, treatment. It's important as far as what they're doing on maintaining the health and safety of the animals, which then obviously lead to a safer food supply, but they are not regulatory. Animal food producers are very, very concerned about having any of the regulatory staff on farm. And so FSIS and CDC is not necessarily regulatory, but anybody else besides APHIS, they have a tremendous concern. So again, in thinking about what kind of, how we're going to have to bridge some of those gaps, there are going to be some real challenges, I think, as we try to make some of those links. But again, APHIS has done a tremendous job as far as doing the surveillance and diagnostic and treatment to prevent some pretty significant challenges or risks relative to zoonotic diseases. That in and of itself is making a big difference relative to human health. The other thing that I think is important to think about is from the public side of things and the media side of things. It's awfully hard to talk about some of these things and get the attention folks wonder relative to biological weapons and things. Are we really doing anything? Is the United States prepared for these types of potential warfare types of things? Because who talks about brucellosis? Who within the folks that you go out and have a cup of coffee with or whatever is thinking about whether or not they're at risk for brucellosis, or even TB from cattle. They think about E. coli, they think about salmonella, they'll think about anthrax or something like that, but not some of these real significant and very costly and could be very economically damaging animal diseases that can actually pass into humans. And so, again, helping educate folks, you have to consider less than 2% of Americans today are in agriculture. And so having them understand what this means to a producer to keep their animals healthy and what it takes and how often the veterinarian has to go out there and the cost of having the veterinarian come out, the treatment, the drugs, it's a significant investment to keep their animals healthy, and yet it is their livelihood. It's everything to them. And so, folks that kind of put off animals aren't being treated well, so we have to worry about public health. It's hard to bridge that gap between an understanding of human health and animal health, given where the public is today. So I think that significant efforts have been made to and success stories. BSE is a tremendous success story relative to surveillance in cattle. And they're just tremendous success stories as far as surveillance, diagnosis, and ways that APHIS has potentially helped prevent some significant outbreaks. But I think that we have a ways to go to help folks understand what the real risks are, what's being done, and how we as an animal health community really do make a difference here, but we have to work together in order to see continued progress.
Thanks very much. I'd like to immediately follow up on what you just talked about. From an outsider's perspective, it looks like government agencies are often just reacting to the latest, very well-publicized threat, H1N1, bird flu, salmonella. So I was wondering if, in whatever order you want to take this, but could you tell us what's really going on behind the scenes? What are some of the diseases that are out there that people might not know about, that the government, the private sector are tracking closely so that they don't become big problems? How are researchers working to prevent them? How can you get the message out? And also, in the context of the recent elections, we're seeing this backlash against big government from lot of things out there. So is there any concern at all that that could affect funding for some of these programs?
That's a lot of questions. Well, in terms of, from the public health perspective, when I look at diseases related to the pet trade, particularly the exotic pet trade, we deal with a lot of unusual things that are what we might call onesies and twosies, but they do represent something that we ought to look very closely at. And a couple of things I was thinking about, some of the viruses, like lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus is a virus that's carried by guinea pigs and certain other species of pet rodents. We've noticed some unusual transmissions in that this virus has been transmitted through organ transplantation into the recipients of persons who died and were infected with LCMV, didn't know it, but had recent contact with furry critters that had been brought into the house. So again, these are not things that are going to turn the United States upside down in terms of preventing a huge threat, but I think we should be very alert to unusual forms of transmission because they do represent risks, obviously, to organ transplantation, which is something we depend very much on here in the United States. So think about unusual forms of transmission. Another unusual thing that you always think you know everything there is to know about a pathogen. And a few years ago, we talk a lot about salmonella. We talk a lot about salmonella, particularly as it affects agricultural animals, but we are very familiar with salmonella in the reptile trade. Everybody knows that you don't, your young children shouldn't be putting pet turtles in their mouths because of salmonella. So you assume that you know everything there is to know about it, but in 2004, we saw the first transmission of multi-drug with resistant salmonella typhimurium from pet rodents. We didn't think that pet rodents could carry salmonella, and of course, who handles pet rodents but young children under the age of 5. So, and then what has further surprised us about salmonella is that there was a recent event in the UK where owners of pet snakes were becoming very ill with a strain of salmonella. Of course, that's maybe not surprising because people associated it with the pet snakes. Well, it turned out they didn't get it from their pet snakes. They got it from the feeder mice that they purchased to feed to the pet snakes. And of course, the feeder mice came from a breeder in the United States. So it goes both ways. I spent a lot of time talking about importation, the risks of importation. We also are share in that obligation in that we should be watching our own pet trade and not be exporting pathogenic strains of bacteria to other countries. And since then, that same strain of salmonella also spread within the United States. So it's my way of saying I think we should be very careful to read and stay on top of literature around the onesies and twosies because they can represent a major emerging trend. Think about the classic zoonosis, which is HIV. Well, in the 80s, it was an emerging infectious disease, and now it's quite prevalent, and it's treatable. We sort of take it for granted, but we have to be very, very attuned to some of the more unusual things that are happening. I don't think I answered even 5% of your questions. We can come back.
I guess from my perspective, there isn't anything lurking under the surface that we're not telling people about or that we should be concerned about in terms of disease. I think from a veterinary perspective, I would bring to the table the issue that veterinary medicine or animal health is the pharmaceutical side is a very, very small industry. It's less than 5% of human health. So we think about a drug like Lipitor that might be a $10 or $15 billion a year drug. That's 5 to 10 times the total pharmaceutical industry on the animal health side. So for pharmaceutical firms on the animal health side to bring new molecules to market is a pretty risky situation in terms of the time and effort and investment that it takes to those new molecules to get them to the point that from discovery to putting them in the hands of a veterinarian that can be used in treating animals. So from our perspective, what we're seeing is a lot of the drugs that come to veterinary medicine are drugs that have come through the human side, if you will, and then been tested and found to be of use in animals, and that's fine. But there are other conditions or other things that we think that, long term coming down the pike where we may need our own drugs and we may need our own discovery and our own new molecules for treatment of diseases that are specific to animals. And again, we are concerned about the regulatory environment and the time and effort that it takes to get things through the pipeline. And for a relatively small market.
I'll take a crack at the questions relative to what's the government doing to prepare, and it seems like it's just a reaction to crisis, as well as what the change in congressional control will do to funding levels and things. I think in some ways that they are interconnected. Certainly, for the most part, the government does have a tremendous number of plans that are on the shelf ready to go in the event that we have some kind of an outbreak or significant action that needs to be dealt with. Specifically from my experience, BSC was one that we didn't anticipate in the United States. But as soon as we got the call that we had a positive, there was an action plan that was on the Secretary's desk within moments. The public wouldn't know that, the media wouldn't know that necessarily, and so, but those are the types of things that certainly APHIS and others work extensively on. Do they have every bit and piece in there? No, and that's part of the reason why you see questions and is the government prepared and things like that, because there's no way in any crisis situation like that you can have thought of every possible scenario, and so there are going to be points where you're going to react to something, or you haven't prepared, or what have you. But for the most part, and you're learning from industry, that's a time especially where you need that close interaction between what's going on the farm or in the processing facilities, et cetera, to be able to work together to find the best solutions and that kind of thing. And the interaction I see relative to the funding on that is the funding, just like the media and the public, Congress reacts to an emergency. And so if there's an outbreak of something, sure, Congress is going to give more money to H1N1. I mean, when we saw that, then you saw the funding levels go to more surveillance and more planning and that kind of thing. So that meant less funding had to go somewhere else because there's only a certain amount of funding. And so I think that no matter what, good times or bad, you're going to see funding levels react to an emergency as well as anything else. Now, my thoughts on relative to congressional control, I think that that like everybody, I don't think anybody's going to be spared a close look relative to what's going on with our budget today. I think everybody is every program within the government, every industry, that gets support is going to be carefully looked at just from the standpoint of whether it's discretionary funds or mandatory funds or whatever. So I don't think that the animal health industry is going to be any different than anybody else. Having said that, I do think that there are certain parts that even some of the most conservative folks believe that government needs to play a role in, and one of those is animal health and helping producers. That certainly producers have a tremendous support for what goes on relative to APHIS and how they help with diagnosis and surveillance and things. And so I think you're going to get tremendous support for continued interaction there. I think where you're going to see some of the issues come out is as producers have more regulatory challenges, and you talked about the challenges of timing and things like that relative to getting animal drugs through the chain. I think the more regulations are coming down from EPA, from FSIS, from FDA, and you see more government interaction, you're going to see more pushback from the animal producers and plant producers to say we can't afford to run our businesses effectively, and that's where you're going to see some potential reaction, whether you're going to, who knows how all that's going to play out, but I do think that you'll see more oversight and a critical look at it.
Animal agriculture and our trade partners. Now, beyond the whole issue of antibiotic resistance, I was wondering if you could address the question of whether you think agricultural production methods in this country are a risk factor for humans. We already talked a little bit about that. And on a related note, more broadly, what are the trade implications of zoonosis, both as a real threat but also as an excuse for your trading partners to refuse to take some of our products?
I think relative to the comments that Congresswoman Slaughter has noted, certainly there is, she has a long history of trying to put some limits on the use of antibiotics. I think that one of the things that the United States has been strong to date, and if we don't go down this route, then I think we're putting ourselves at risk, is staying with the science. And no matter what we do with our trading partners, if staying true to the science and arguing those points, it takes time and it's tough and it's often easier to just try to think, let's just deal with a trading partner, open up a market, keep things safe. But staying true to that science keeps us on a straightforward path, and there's a lot of support from the industry standpoint. They always have the ability to market their products to a country differently if they choose not to use certain antibiotics or certain animal drugs. Then they have that right to do that, to sell it to a country. But it's not a government stance in the sense of we're going to go against where the science says and go a different way. So I think that in response to that, to her comments, certainly, with our trade issues and things like that, we can always, and it's a lengthy process, but using the WTO and things like that, there's always the risk, and there's a strong risk that these types of issues are trade barriers and are used as trade barriers. They are used as trade barriers. It's reality. And that will always be the case. I can't imagine a situation where everybody's going to view the science in the same way. Some of it's political, some of it's scientific interpretation. So I think that there's always going to be that issue, and I think that the stronger the U.S. stays to our scientific basis, and the better off we are. And again, talking to the industry as far as maintaining a market, should they so choose, is their choice.
I can make a comment. The international health regulations that were adopted in 2005 will be expected to be fully enforced by 2012. And countries right now are trying to assess whether they're capable of implementing the international health regulations. And so this was set forth by WHO, and I think every country should consider how it can protect other countries. And so just comment very briefly on the antimicrobial resistance can be considered an emerging infectious disease because it's a way that antibiotic-resistant infections can be transmitted around the world. So I do think that countries that are under the international health regulations, I think countries that are importing can say, we don't want this product because we fear it's a risk, and I think that's the broader implications of zoonotic diseases as well. We don't want this animal species imported into our country because we fear it will spread XYZ disease. On the other hand, the exporting country here in the United States, I think we do have an obligation to consider what are we spreading around the world, and what can we do to limit the transmission of diseases from the United States. And in the case of some of our regulations, some of our own CDC regulations around the exportation of animals. We don't have any regulations at CDC that allows us to have the authority to prevent exportation of animals. Our regulations only pertain to the importation of animals. So many of our regulations are quite outdated. Just one other comment with respect to H1N1. I don't think, we were all caught off guard because nobody ever expected that H1N1 would emerge in the United States. And once it took off, there were a lot of questions around what is the United States doing to prevent H1N1 spreading to other countries. Here it's now a zoonotic disease spreading rapidly from human to human. What is the United States doing to prevent it from getting into Europe? And there was a point early on in the pandemic where we were very harshly criticized for not screening, doing exit screening of people departing the United States for Europe because they felt very strongly that we weren't doing enough to protect Europe. So I think that we do have to think about what we're exporting as well as what we're importing. And think about it in terms of newer regulations such as WHO and revisit some of our older regulations or non-existent regulations.
One thing I'm just going to add to that too. I think it's a good point as far as looking at where our regulations are and being prepared. Again, it takes a long time to do regulations and get them through the pike, but one of the things I think we learned with H1N1 and in particular was regionalization. And whether that's in the United States or whether that's in another country is, again, the more we know about a particular disease and the more scientific basis we have, we can adapt our regulations so that we're basing it on science and the fact that, because we have H1N1 in a particular area or in a particular, region, what have you, doesn't mean that it's all across the United States and we should stop all poultry exports or imports, frankly, because it's in Europe. And, I think it's important to look at those kinds of things as we look at the trade implications and say, how can we work together so that we truly are not overreacting and not adding to the scare and the concern that people, tend to do. They all, our natural reaction is, oh my gosh, there's H1N1, we're all going to die from that, or we're going to spread it if we leave the country or something. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure we look at it carefully and get the facts out there.
That when you have the media, the public, it's going to be very hard to say our chickens in Connecticut are sick, but not the ones in New Mexico, so, foreign countries should take them. How do you think that's is that going to happen?
I think it is a tremendous challenge, and but I also think that if we don't maintain that, we are adding to the misinformation and not being responsible. And yes, it's hard. Yes, we're going to get hit. Yes, countries are going to say, "Oh, well, I just don't trust it." That's absolutely right, but that's why we have experts, and that's why, we have experts both in the scientific profession as well as in the international trade world to help make those arguments. And, the media is going to go out and they're going to tell their stories, and there are lots of self-proclaimed experts that, frankly, are more than willing to go talk to somebody in the media to talk about how, dangerous something is or how risky something is. And, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to help clarify that so that we can, when you talk about making sure that we're prepared, the more we have to react to inaccurate information, the less we can prepare and responsibly respond to issues that are a concern, because there are real issues out there, and that's where the funding and the attention and the research, that's where we really need to focus. So I think we just have to keep working at it.
Experts here have very specific questions I'd like to ask you, but this is for Dr. Albers and whoever else wants to dive in, but you mentioned this in your opening remarks a little bit, that rabies is one of the best tracked illnesses in the U.S. It's obviously because of the clear public threat. Are there other potential pet-borne illnesses that should be better tracked because of their danger to human health? We're starting to talk about that. The specific questions I have were, what are the obstacles to getting federal authorities to create a mandatory reporting requirement? And in the wake of this kind of public backlash against government that we're seeing right now, if the public doesn't support giving the federal government more power to keep track of all of these pet-borne illnesses and create like a national database, do you think that private sector collaboration is a viable solution, or would this never work without the government getting involved?
Yeah, I do think it's a viable solution, and I think it's unfortunate that the government doesn't see it as a priority. There was a meeting under the auspices of Health and Human Services a few years ago, which we discussed this, and the consensus that came out of that meeting was that because pet animals, as far as we know at least, are not likely sentinels for either pandemics or bioterrorism, that there wasn't any support on the government side to contribute to that effort to collect disease incidence data. So it pretty much told us that if we were going to do it, we had to do it on our own. And there are some fledgling kind of steps in that direction. The organization that I previously was with, the American Animal Hospital Association, has promulgated standard disease codes for pet animals, and they're working with the manufacturers of practice management software systems to get those codes incorporated into the systems. Then, of course, we have to get the veterinarians and the practices to enter those codes, and then, more importantly, have some way of extracting that data on a regular basis from a representative sample of practices across the country, and then having it looked at by epidemiologists or experts who can spot disease trends. So I do think it'll happen. I think it'll be slow. But the point was made at the meeting that I referenced a little bit ago about that was hosted by Health and Human Services, that, well, if pets are living in over half the households in the United States, it should be an interest of the public, and there should be some government contribution, if you will, to help monitor pet diseases. But at the time, at least in that environment, it didn't carry a lot of weight. Pets are seen, unfortunately, by some as sort of a luxury, or because we don't eat them, fortunately, or because they don't necessarily serve as sentinels, that they don't deserve the same level of control, if you will, or monitoring that the animals that contribute to food. I personally think it's a bit short-sighted. As I said, we live in extraordinarily close contact and communication with pets, and we should have a better idea of what's going on.
Are there specific threats that
No, there really aren't. I mean, I think, I mentioned the infectious diseases and the parasites of pets. They really are well controlled. If there's a threat there, it's because compliance isn't always good. Just because we have effective medications doesn't mean that every pet is getting them all the time. So that's a bit of a concern to us. But there aren't diseases out there that, we should say, oh my gosh, this is something bad is about to happen.
I think that there is value, though, in searching for certain pathogens that might can be of importance. I'll give an example. You mentioned lepto. Leptospirosis is spread by contaminated water, and it can be spread from dogs directly to humans. And so I think from the public health standpoint, we'd like to know what's the attributable risk of dog ownership to human leptospirosis. And so then lepto is reportable in 35 states. It's not nationally reportable anymore.